Good evening and welcome to the LaRouche Organization Symposium. Today is Friday, October 17th, and we're just going to get right into it. This presentation is perhaps a few days too late, but it's never too late to discuss the scientific principles that led to the development of the United States of America ultimately. And unfortunately, scientific progress has become a controversial matter. What I'm referring to is Christopher Columbus and the breakthroughs in science out of the Italian Renaissance, and the Italian Renaissance coming out of the Dark Ages that led to his phenomenal voyage, which required a great deal of scientific discovery and overcoming the superstitions and various other problems of even his own crew. So I'm going to bring on Tim Rush, who many of you may know, one of the leaders of the LaRouche movement and who heads up the activist call on Monday nights. And he is going to be telling us a few things about what led into the breakthrough made by Columbus. So I'm going to just stop right there and let Tim go ahead.
Well, thank you, Diane. A few months ago on a Friday symposium, Chris Sayre presented an overview of key figures involved in a transmission belt that in a certain way goes from Nicholas of Cusa, the Council of Florence, in the end of the 1430s, up to the founding of the United States. I'm not going to review some of that. It had terrific quotes. There's a great deal in there. I will be filling out the beginning of that in a way that I'm just delighted to present to everyone tonight. I had first done research on the question of what I call the basically Florentine Renaissance launching the Columbus's voyage. I did articles in 1992. 5 years ago, came back to it, distilled some new material. But I'm just thrilled that looking into it afresh, I've come across some really wonderful, rich detail that we didn't have before, of an astounding picture of how his voyages were the fruit of 3 generations of just extraordinary collaboration between centers of the Renaissance, primarily Florence, but also Rome and also Flanders, Bruges, for instance, and Burgundy, and the explorations launched particularly around Henry the Navigator, who was the third son of the king who founded the modern founded a new dynasty in Portugal at the beginning of the 1400s. So what I'm going to do is just fill in quickly what were the really tremendous scientific breakthroughs that underlay Columbus's voyage. Then I'm going to go back and fill in the tissue of the way Portuguese leaders and the leaders of the Renaissance in Italy were in not just communication, but intimate personal contact in ways that I think will fill in something that always had perplexed me in a way. Lyndon LaRouche insisted that Cusa had insisted you had to go to flank the oligarchical elements around Europe, and certainly what the Ottoman Turks represented, that you had to have a breakout from Europe in terms of developing deep ocean navigation and getting to the Americas, in effect. Not known at the time, but that exploration effort needed to be undertaken. And I never found anything in Cusa discussing it directly. But I think what we're going to find out tonight is that his intimate circle and him in the middle of it did indeed take that initiative. So just to whet your appetites a little bit here. If we could look at the Renaissance Apollo project that launched Columbus. Let's go to the next slide. This is the famous Cathedral of Florence. This is the dome constructed by Filippo Brunelleschi. I want you to just note for now the round tondels, as they're called, those windows there underneath the actual arch of the dome. You're going to find that relevant to a later part of what I'm going to present to you. People should just know that this was completed around 1436. Council of Florence, which brought the Eastern and Western churches together for the first time ever, really, and involved Nicholas of Cusa as one of the two principal organizers, took place underneath this dome. Next slide, please. Well, here we have Henry the Navigator at Sagres. This is a statue of Sagres. Sagres is at the tip of a point of Portugal, which is most projects out into the Atlantic. And he had, he didn't assemble a big think tank literally at that site, but he did have constant activity at that site. And he was born, as you can see there, in 1394. He first launched an exploratory voyage from Portugal to start explorations when he was 22 in 1416. And he launched one trip per year for about 20 years or so. It doubled, it tripled, it quadrupled. And what he assembled over the rest of his life and then bequeathed as an ongoing tremendous enterprise, they called it the Atlantic Enterprise, were an enormous extension of not only geographic knowledge, knowledge of currents, knowledge of navigation, and so forth, but it established a principle of being able to harness deep sea voyaging at will anywhere on the globe. Previous to this, you had remarkable fleets that came from China. Admiral Zheng He had gone into the Indian Ocean. Some say he got as far as the Red Sea, sent emissaries into Western Europe and so forth. You had back, 2,000 more years ago, some voyages that from certain parts of the Mediterranean, but all the way out into the Pacific. Very remarkable voyages, but there was no in-depth capacity to sustain and develop this as a principle that, in essence, could be harnessed anywhere and by anybody. This is the gift of Henry the Navigator. Next slide. The first of his three sailing breakthroughs was the adoption of a type of boat called the Caravelle. This is a picture of it. It has lateen sails, which are those sort of triangular sails that come down like that rather than square rigging. Lateen sails allow you to sail closer to the wind than you can with other kinds of rigging, which means that when you face difficult wind conditions, you're able to make much greater progress than you can otherwise. It's also has a deeper draft, but narrow. Many of the boat, most travels from the Mediterranean and are all the way around to Flanders and so forth were by galleys at the time of Henry the Navigator. This is quite astonishing. I mean, most of it were galleys like you imagine at the time of the Romans, because they really couldn't control. With winds, they could be pushed back too far. With galleys, they at least had a slow but secure rate of progress. They also had very flat-bottomed, sort of tubby boats that couldn't handle rough water conditions from the high seas. So that's number one. Number two, next slide. I want to get at this with just a little introduction. Many of these pictures, by the way, are ones that I took when I was in Florence about 8 years ago. This is Giotto's Campanile, which was built actually preceding the Dome of Florence, which is to the right. In this picture, you don't see it, but if your eye was just moving further to the right, you'd get there. This was at the base of this campanile. Next slide. You can see just above the doorway, there is a band that goes left and right of hexagonal medallions, which were put in there by a great Florentine artist named Andrea Pisano. And what he did, 26 of them were designed to illustrate all the fruits of the human mind in science, in agriculture, in ships, in astronomy, etc. Just all the productive activity of the mind And these, as you can see, are at the lowest part of the campanile. The campanile soars up above it. But the idea was to have almost a constant gallery for the population to be able to be refreshed by the celebration of these productive and just the powers of creativity. Next slide. So this is where we get to the second of the breakthroughs from the Henry the Navigator's group. This one depicts man's creative powers in navigation. The man in the back of the boat is using a magnetic compass, which had actually come in from I believe, from the Chinese sometime before, but it's being used in navigation. And the next slide. This shows someone on land, a savant, some kind of astronomer, using a quadrant, which is a way to take the height of the sun or the stars. This was used by Columbus, by the way, a quadrant. He may well have used an astrolabe, which is a more significantly more sophisticated instrument. But you see a globe on his desk. And the second of the breakthroughs around Henry the Navigator's Atlantic Enterprise project and exploration project was to put these two universes together. Up until his efforts, you had fairly advanced astronomy, some of it hooked to astrology, some of it just good astronomy, on land in centers like Toledo in Spain, or what Toscanelli, a great astronomer as well as mathematician and so forth, in Florence was doing. But at sea, the navigation was still largely just keeping trying to stay within eye contact of land or known areas, rather than going out into deep seas to just do long explorations. He put it together so that on board ship you were able to get access to the more refined navigational techniques, and this was absolutely necessary because the Portuguese, many of his early voyages were trying to go down along the African coast. Now, you've got to understand the immensity of the African continent. It's about 500 miles of the northwest African coast, which is where the Sahara Desert meets the coast. It's very forbidding. You don't have, in fact, one place the sand blows out to sea for 2 miles. So you have to go very long distance, and then you begin to get into the verdant areas of the Senegal River, and on into equatorial Africa. This had been considered an impossible barrier for a long time. So if you're going south and you begin to succeed to get that far south, you get closer and closer to the equator. Now that creates a problem, because the central way that you navigate is by the North Star at night, and you can't see the North Star once you begin to get close to the equator. So the Portuguese take all kinds of tables of solar height and are able to match that to latitudes that allow them then to continue further and further down the African coast. So this is the second of the breakthroughs. Now to the third. Harnessing the currents and the winds. In the northern hemisphere, it's called the Coriolis effect. You can see that sort of circle of the northeast trades. The upper part of it parallels what is the current, the Gulf Stream current. It's the opposite direction in the southern hemisphere, as probably people know. When the Portuguese, and you could see Portugal in little black, I can't put my cursor there, but maybe you can see this. I don't know. Anyway, when you start going down the African coast, initially the winds are very favorable. As you can see, you're on the eastern bend of the northeast trades. Once you get to Guinea, and then around into the Bight of Benin, as it's called, you have exactly the opposite effect. You have contrary winds that are extremely difficult to handle. So what the Portuguese came up with, which is brilliant. Let's go to the next slide. Oh, darn. Next slide after this. Okay, well, I didn't get in a slide here that I meant to. What they did is something called a long ocean tack. Henry had sent people out, and they discovered islands. They rediscovered the Madeira Islands, which Portugal is in charge of to this day, and they also went as far out as the Azores, which are 850 miles. So you begin to get an idea that they were already doing very adventuresome explorations. 850 miles directly out into the Atlantic is not a cheap shot. Let's go back to the winds there so that we can illustrate this. One more. There. Now, what they did is they would go down as far as they could in Africa in the explorations, but coming back, they would be facing very harsh winds once they got up to the big bight of Africa around where today Mauritania is. What they did is they set out directly into the Atlantic all the way up to the Azores, and from the Azores, they were able to hop back to Portugal, that 850 miles, with the variable winds on the northern side of the what's called the Northeast Trades here. So in effect, it was like a slingshot. They traveled much greater distance in the ocean, but they saved a lot of time. It was a least time principle because they were able to, it's called a long ocean tack. Now, the Portuguese, when they finally were able to get all the way around Africa and head into India with the Vasco da Gama voyage about 1446, I believe it was, what they did is a even bigger slingshot. They went down across along the African coast with favorable currents. They shifted all the way down to the edge of Brazil, and you can see the trades in the Brazil, near Brazil are going across, and they shuttled from Brazil all the way over to the Cape of Good Hope. What a tremendous ocean sailing feat, and then from there on to India. That was 3 times the time and twice the distance of what Columbus did, but it saved them enormous amounts of time in terms of fighting the currents had they just tried to go coastwise. Now, Columbus utilized all this knowledge that the Portuguese had derived when he made his voyage, because he went down to the Canaries, which is off the Canary Islands, which is off the northwest coast of Africa, then shot across on the lower side of the Northeast Trades, which takes you right up into the Caribbean. Then he came back on a more northerly route that brought him toward the Azores with the variable winds that he was able to harness, and he knew he had over 10 years of sailing with the Portuguese under his belt, and that brought him back to the Iberian Peninsula. So those 3 breakthroughs defined a capability that then, this is what I'll develop for the rest of this initial part of the talk, is harnessed to a profound collaboration between the Portuguese and particularly Florence. So let's go on to that. This is a map, by the way, of what the great Florentine astronomer, mathematician, physician, just great polymath mind, Paolo da Pozzo Toscanelli. He sent a map that illustrates what he was recommending to Portugal to undertake. He sent it to Columbus, but and to other contacts of Florence in Portugal. But this is a recreation. We don't actually physically have the map, but it was referred to by many people, and it's a fairly creditable reconstruction. Next. Okay. Now, what I'm going to present now is new material, and it's very exciting material. The reason I wanted the map in there is that up until around 1900 or so, it was taken as standard knowledge that Toscanelli had sent a map and a letter to the Portuguese, and it had gotten into Columbus's hands. Columbus had initiated some kind of direct communication with Toscanelli and so forth. And this was taken as an important part of what solidified Columbus's project of going west to reach the east. In 1900, a counterattack emerged. I'm not going to do details, claiming that the letters were fake, that there was no connection to Toscanelli. Toscanelli would never have bothered with a lowly seafarer like Columbus, and basically tried to trash the idea that there was any connection to Florence, to Toscanelli, and so forth. So what we're going to see here is just the richness of what really was a phenomenal collaboration. This is the corner of the cloister of the Church of San Lorenzo, the dome in the back there, which gives you a little bit of it mimics a bit of the dome of the cathedral, Brunelleschi's dome. This is the cloister right next to it, and in the far corner behind that mulberry tree or whatever it is in the middle is the entrance to this library. And I was able to go to it 7 years ago, and I was able to actually see the archive of the correspondence between Portuguese leaders, a whole range of other officials, bishops, magnates, various others from Portugal and from across Italy and other parts of Europe, that all centered on the work of a remarkable Portuguese abbot named Gomes Eanes. So I was able to look at these documents, and let's go to the next slide. This is the room where they bring out the documents to you, and then the slide after this. This is a picture that I took of the cover sheet of the bulk of these records. And by the way, they just bring them out. These are not copies that they present you with. You don't look at them on some kind of those audio tapes, or those tape machines and stuff. I was physically holding this in my hand. And it says Epistolarum. It's a record of letters involving kings, queens, princes, bishops, magnates, etc., many others. And then it talks about Abate Santa Maria di Florencia, and then A.B. Gomezzi at the end. This is the abbot Gomes Eanes, who was the abbot of what was called the Badia, which was the abbey of Florence, St. Mary of Florence, for about 20 years, from 1420 to 1439, really. And he was a towering figure. He built this abbey up. It had been in the neglect. It happens to be across the street from the center of the book industry of Florence at that time. And the booksellers and the book people producing the illustrated manuscripts and so forth, it was just a beehive of the humanist ferment in Florence at that time. People would meet there regularly to discuss the ideas that went into the Council of Florence. You had Brunelleschi. You would have Poggio Bracciolini. There are all kinds of key figures who are all centered around this intense intellectual activity in this book district, and it was across the street from this abbey. And Gomes Eanes fully participated in it. He equipped his abbey with magnificent collection of books, and he worked. He didn't work directly, but the man who emerged as the supreme bookseller and coordinator of all this activity, a fellow named Vespasiano di Bisticci, Rader wrote short biographical notes on dozens and dozens of the key figures of this time, and in fact, we'll get to that later. Several key Portuguese that we'll be meeting. Let's go to the next slide. This is the left image gives is a kind of hoot. The right is much more austere, but these were thought to be images of Gomes Eanes. His dates are 1383 to 1459. Next slide. Now, this is the chapel of Maria degli Angeli. It was a lovely afternoon when I was walking by this. This was designed by Filippo Brunelleschi. When I asked you before to take note in the Dome of Florence, those rondels, those round windows, that's a trademark of his style of architecture. So he put it into this small chapel. This is the Camaldolese was a suborder of the Benedictines. The abbey run by Gomes Eanes was Benedictine, and Gomes Eanes was working very, very closely with the head of the Camaldolese chapter in Florence, and that was Traversari. I'm forgetting his first name for a moment here. Ambrogio Traversari. Traversari was, with Cusa, the principal organizer of the Council of Florence. He was the supreme Hellenist. He had learned Greek very well from some people from Constantinople who had come through. And it was a tremendous center of learning and this ecumenical drive that Cusa so beautifully expressed later in De Pace Fide, on the Peace of Faith. So this was like a second home for Gomesianis. Traversari died in 1439, right in the middle of the Council of Florence. Immediately, Gomesianis was elected to take Traversari's role as head of the Camaldolese. Before he died, Traversari was able to sign with Gomesianis that was called the Decree of Union that brought the two churches together, East and West. This is where the filioque concept that Chris Serra was emphasizing back in his talk during the summer comes in. That man is man expresses the full creative powers of God. That Christ expresses the full creative powers of God as well as being man. It's a crucial idea. What Cusa called it was imago viva Dei, that we are in the living image of God. And that had been disputed by the Eastern Church, but they were brought to agree to it in this famous council. And within that is the seed of a very, very profound upshift in the conception of man. So let's go to, oh, by the way, in the Council of Florence, one of the Eastern church leaders, Plethon, brought the historic work of Strabo, who was a Greek geometer preceding Ptolemy. Ptolemy's maps showed land encircling the Indian Ocean, so you could never get around Africa. Strabo had a much more accurate picture of how you could get around Africa based on an Egyptian voyage of many, many years earlier. So this was circulated in the Council of Florence as a stimulus to thinking about how you could circumnavigate Africa, which is exactly the kind of progress that Henry the Navigator is making, and also go out in deep sea voyaging further afield. Next slide, please. This is the bust of Ambrogio Traversari inside the chapel that I just showed you. Next slide. Now, a little bit more on Toscanelli, because he's just such a central figure when you go back to the letters and the map and so forth in terms of the work with the circles of Henry the Navigator in Portugal and with Columbus. This is a painting, famous one by Sandro Botticelli from 1480, but it's widely thought that the face was modeled on that of Paolo dal Pozzo Toscanelli. Look at his dates, 1397 to 1482. So he was 85 years old when he died. He was able to live a full 20 years or so beyond Henry the Navigator, beyond Cusa, beyond Gomesianis and so forth. So he was able to personally, having participated in all of these conclaves, all of these discussions, he was able to carry that forward for a whole new generation. Columbus being an outstanding example of that. Next slide. And one of the things that he did was in terms of the astronomy work that he did, was he cut a hole in the lantern, which is the very top of the cupola. I don't want us to go all the way back to that because I think people have an image of the Dome of Florence in their minds. But once you have the curvature of the dome, above that you have this what's called the lantern, which is another structure that has this big golden ball on the top of it. And that was not finished at the time that the rest of the cathedral was finished. It was another 30 years or so. But when it was finished, Toscanelli was able to put this special aperture in there that cast a light from the sun down. Oh, there we go. So you see the lantern at the top. That's that final structure. And you see the golden ball at the top. And so it's a relatively small hole that Toscanelli put in there. If you go in and look up from inside, you can hardly see it. But it projects this beautiful beam of light down. And for about, I think 15 or maybe 45 days before the summer solstice, around June 21st, and a similar time afterwards, you can mark across the floor, there you go, the way that the shadow at noon falls. And at the actual solstice, there's a round circle on the floor, and when it coincides directly with it, you have the absolute down to the second to be able to mark the solar solstice. So, and you can see that it's a big event when this happens. You get people crowding around, taking their pictures, and so forth. Next slide, please. Okay, now to understand this, I want to just backtrack slightly to something very important in the 1420s, which is that Henry the Navigator's next older brother, Don Pedro, there were whole four brothers, I think. One of them is now King Duarte. The second brother, named Pedro, went on a huge tour across Europe from 1425 to 1428. And his last stop was in Florence. He spent 2-3 months there. He was hosted by Gomesianes at the Badia, at the Abbey, the Benedictine Abbey, across the street from all the booksellers and all the intellectual life. And he was brought into discussions with Traversari, with Brunelleschi, with Toscanelli, and so forth. They left him. They gave him lots of scientific material, other treatises, various translations of Roman and Greek work, and so forth. The whole flourishing of the Renaissance was sent back with him to Portugal. And the reason I wanted to stress that is that at the end of the Council of Florence, Gomesianes goes back to Portugal, and for the next 20 years, he's one of the top prelates, top clerics of Portugal, continuing a very intense back and forth with Rome as a sequence of Renaissance popes take over, with Florence, with developments in the Low Countries. A sister of Henry the Navigator and of Pedro, Isabella, has married the Duke of Burgundy, and Burgundy was then in control of the lowlands, of Bruges, for instance, of Flanders, which is a huge hotbed of the Northern Renaissance. So the Portuguese royal family spanned directly a very broad intersection with Renaissance centers of Europe. And in fact, Lisbon was, if not one of the major ports of the whole period. So Pedro was regent after his brother died, was regent while his older brother's young son, Alfonso V, was growing up, all during the 1440s. So he was promoting Gomesianes. In fact, he commissioned a biography of Gomesianes. So the fact that Pedro had been in Florence, was the conduit, all during the 1440s, this took shape in even more intense form. The voyages from Henry the Navigator's efforts, which had been 1 a year, went to 3 or 4 a year. They were making great progress around Africa. They were using this long ocean tack. They were developing the navigational things. But at the end of that decade, Pedro very unwisely challenged the efforts of others in the royal court to bring Alfonso V to the throne. He had been a minor before then, and in a battle called Alforjabeda, he lost his life, and his son, named Jaime, like James, Jaime, who was 15 years old at the time, survived under a whole pile of corpses and managed somehow to crawl out from this disaster. But because of the strength of the connections of the royal family with all these Renaissance centers, he and and Jaime and his brothers and sisters, they went to Flanders for a few years. The royal house of his cousin, Alfonso V, rehabilitated him. He was brought into Rome, and in the mid 1450s, he was made a cardinal at age 20. Now, he wasn't made cardinal because he had such an illustrious church career. He was apparently a very virtuous person. He was not some kind of profligate type or anything like that. But he was made there as an emblem of intensifying the connections between Florence, Rome, and the Portuguese. And he was in Rome. He was crossing paths with Nicholas of Cusa and so forth. When he got to, he was summoned to do a very important mission for the Pope. I think it was I can't remember which pope it was in 1459. I think Pius II, Aeneas Silvius Piccolomini had just become pope. He was sent on a mission, but when he got to he became sick when he got to Florence. Toscanelli pulled together a group of leading lights of Florence to meet with the entourage of Jaime and discuss a project of sailing west. And it turns out that Nicholas of Cusa was a good map maker. Toscanelli was a very good map maker. They commissioned other tremendous maps at the time. They all were going to have a conclave about that. But Jaime sickened, and they weren't. I mean, I think they had some meetings, but they weren't able to carry through the full in-depth project they wanted. The two attending physicians for Jaime were a fellow from Portugal named Fernão Martins and Toscanelli. Now, Fernão Martins had been part of the entourage, or like a personal secretary to Jaime for the preceding 5 years, and his cousin Antão Martins had gone with Cusa to Constantinople to persuade leading figures from Constantinople to come to the Council of Florence and bring with them a lot of the learning that had been the ancient learning that was in the hands of the Eastern Church. So Antão Martins and his cousin is with Jaime, and they come to Florence. Jaime dies there. You have Toscanelli and Fernão Martins, the cousin, attending physicians, and in these conclaves to discuss going west through sailing ventures and so forth. And what Florence did, very remarkable, is they were very parsimonious. They had something called the Monte di something or other, which was the sort of bank for the municipal government. They footed most of the bill to build a beautiful chapel dedicated to Jaime in this lovely Renaissance church called San Miniato al Monte, which is on a hill just behind a very famous overlook. Any of you who've gone to Florence probably went to the Piazzale Michelangelo, which is one of these great outlooks that everybody thrills at looking at Florence. And the hill just above it is this church. Next slide. The Portuguese built a beautiful, beautiful chapel. I mean, the Portuguese helped, but the Florentines built this beautiful chapel in the memory of Jaime. That's a painting by Paolo. I can't get the pronunciation right. But about 3 or 4 of the absolute preeminent artists of the period participated in designing and building this chapel. Next slide. The roof is, these are beautiful terracotta tiles done by Luca della Robbia, who did the famous in the Duomo, the singing boys, the cantoria, all the sculptures that celebrate the music and actually show bel canto methods at the time in the cathedral. He's the artist who was commissioned to do this in Jaime's chapel. Let's hold on that. So I think I've covered most. Oh no, the one last piece that's very important. From the time that Jaime died, Fernão Martins transferred his activity and became a part of Nicholas of Cusa's personal entourage. It doesn't convey it. An intimate. He became a physician to Cusa along with Toscanelli. He went to Rome. He was at this point. Cusa has become vicar general of the Catholic Church, which was really number 2 in the whole church hierarchy in Rome, below Pius II, the Pope. And he works so closely with Fernão Martins of Portugal that he puts Fernão into as a character in one of the supreme dialogues that Cusa wrote called De Non Aliud, on the not other. He also puts in another very important humanist figure in there. By the way, Cusa had been so close to Toscanelli. They went to school together in Padua back in the 1420s. They never lost contact. In fact, there were such intimate discussions over mathematical questions, and people should know Cusa was fascinated by how to take mathematical analogies to the relation of man to God and the universe. So Cusa dedicated 2 or 3 of his treatises on mathematical questions to Toscanelli. So the intimacy in terms of the intellectual life of Fernão Martins, of Cusa, of Toscanelli was cemented at this point. When Cusa died in 1464, it was Toscanelli and Martins who were the 2 of the 3 executors of the will of Cusa, and had been the attending physicians for Cusa before he died in August of 1464. So Fernão Martins stayed in Italy for another 2 years until the dedication of the Jaime Chapel in San Miniato dal Monte. Then he goes back to as one of the 2 or 3 top. He was the canon of the Lisbon Cathedral, which was very, very prestigious church position in Portugal. He kept up all of the contacts that he had developed when he was working with Cusa, when he was working with Jaime, when he was in Florence, and so forth. So in 1474, when the first letter that we know of between Toscanelli to Fernão Martins, and that has survived in a copy written out directly by Columbus. So he knew that letter, whether he had direct contact otherwise with Toscanelli, which I think is likely, but we don't have the letter is an extant. But we know that letter was in Columbus's hands, and rather than it being something which you can discredit by saying that it didn't happen and therefore you don't have a connection, it's the most obvious thing in the world that there would be these consultations of a very high quality of exploratory options involving the particularly Toscanelli and particularly Fernão Martins. Keep in mind that 1453 is when Constantinople is overrun by the Ottoman Turks. The Venetians played a very ugly role in that. And it's notable that the Portuguese connection to Italy up until around 1430 had included sort of a certain intersection with Venice. They cut that off. The Portuguese did not work through Venice. They worked very singularly through Florence. And that has a great deal of significance. So after 1453 is when you begin to have Toscanelli calling this meeting when Jaime was ill in Florence to discuss moving west. By 1474, the option for Portugal was very intense because they had now gotten in their voyages, these successive yearly voyages that Henry the Navigator had launched, they'd gotten to the Gulf of Benin, which is reaching out toward where Nigeria, Cameroon, and so forth are today. And then suddenly they found that the coast was tailing south again, and south for another 4,000 miles or so. So they were distraught. They really, this was way colossally, this was almost cataclysmic in terms of being able to reach India by going around Africa. So they were very seriously looking to think of themselves going west. And during the next decade, they had about 8 voyages in various ways to try to sort of probe going west. But it was the kind of inspiration provided by the Toscanelli letter, and obviously what Fernão Martins was able to communicate to Columbus, as well as the whole wealth of his 10 years in the midst of this beehive of exploratory, intense work. And Columbus took voyages on Portuguese ships down into Guinea, up toward Britain. There's possibility went as far as Iceland. I mean, he was a very, very capable seaman, trained in all of these methods by the Portuguese. He then turned to Spain when he didn't get an okay from the Portuguese court to sponsor his going west. But even as late as 1488, when he'd been in Spain for a few years, he came back to Portugal to try to pitch this project again. And the Portuguese were very receptive. They brought him to court. They talked to him. But as he was there, they got word that Bartolomeo Dias, who was the captain in the most recent of the Portuguese explorations, had gotten to the Cape of Good Hope. on the southern tip of Africa. So now they knew they had a secure route to the Indies. And Columbus was actually in Lisbon when Bartolome Diaz came back and was, given a hero's welcome. So at that point, he knew that he wasn't going to get the official sanction there. He went further to the Spanish side. The money that financed Columbus's voyage did not come from the Spanish crown. It came from Florentine merchants, particularly the Medici Bank in Seville. That was the local manager of it was Amerigo Vespucci. So you begin to get an idea just how fundamental this, from 1420 or so on to Columbus's voyage, this transmission belt, this quality of deliberation involving the centers of the Renaissance in Florence, Rome, Flanders, and Portugal, provided the framework for what was very, very extraordinary seamanship by Columbus in making his voyages. So let me leave things there, and I know that there's much more to explore in terms of why Columbus is so is a lightning rod for so much of the culture wars. But let me leave my presentation at this point.
Well, I'd like you to just address, why was this significant in the first place? I mean, everyone hears that everyone at the time thought the world was flat. There's the children's version of this story. Everyone thought the world was flat. Columbus took this trip. Could you explain how this was significant and that wasn't exactly I know you've gone through this whole thing, but.
Sure. Well, the point on this is that
obviously the map makers didn't think the world was flat.
No.
And I don't even know how widespread that was, although I guess his crew, at least Washington Irving describes that his crew was very superstitious. And maybe a bunch of them thought the earth was flat, so he had to hide the charts. But what?
Yeah, I don't know about that. I think that most seamen certainly were aware of how your landmarks fell away as you go to sea, et cetera. And you can tell from just the difference in your latitudes if you're going north and south and so forth that it doesn't make sense unless you're on a round surface. So I think that by and large, now there was not superstition, but there was a lot of fear. For instance, when the Portuguese were trying to get down across that northwest area of Africa, where the Sahara Desert is up against the sea for 500 miles, they really felt. I mean, the ancient traditions that included Ptolemy said essentially that the tropics were uninhabitable, and it was a very, very harsh climate trying to get past that. So there was a funny story. There's a small promontory that's completely how today is unnoticed, called Bojador. It's somewhere sort of southern Morocco, I think, maybe Mauritania. But it's where a tremendous amount of the sand blew off the Sahara out into the ocean. And the sailors would just refuse to sail past it. So at a certain point, one of Henry Navigator's captains took the boat out to sea, and at night did an end run around and came back to the shore below Bojador and proved that you could actually go that way. Otherwise, there was. I don't want to go into more details, but there was really, really supreme seamanship that Columbus was able to wield with the tools that he had absorbed and which had been generated by this whole process I was describing. But deploying them was, including using those ocean currents the way he did. They knew that there was likely to be land in roughly 30 days. Because they had seen logs and other things coming in. There was a lot of, the whole Plato in the Atlantis story that is in Plato's Timaeus. There were other things that made it. The idea that there was land more or less at the distance that he did find it was something that was discussed by the circles that sponsored Columbus. The fact that he said it was Cathay, he was reaching China, And the fact that the letters that Toscanelli was writing were saying, you're going to get to the spices, he sort of portrayed it in mercantile terms, what the benefits would be of going west at that point. That was not a minor consideration, because the Turks, in taking over Eastern Mediterranean, were cutting off all of the routes that the spices had been coming in for centuries and centuries. So, but, it's not the case that Columbus thought the world was one, that he had an idea that the Earth was only 3/4 of the size that it is. They didn't know how far China extended, so it wasn't impossible that you could reach China within a relative, the distance that he anticipated. But they knew there was land,
right?
And they wanted to find out what was out there. And that's an exploratory. That's why the comparisons to the Apollo project are useful. Let me go to those final 2 slides now, and then we can open things up a little bit.
Okay.
This is from a wonderful article by Lyndon LaRouche that appeared October 26, 1996 in the EIR, Why We Must Colonize Mars. He says, what is the economic principle which defines a science driver space exploration program as key to a successful near-term recovery from the presently deepening global economic depression? Let us name this topic the Christopher Columbus principle of economic science.
Huh.
And that emphasis is in the original. And then later on in the same piece, let me go to the final one. Drive the rate of realization of scientific discoveries of principle to the limit, and mobilize the material, educational, and health resources needed to enable modern Christopher Columbuses to succeed in their voyages of discovery beyond new frontiers.
Great. One of the things, and already when I was growing up, before we had cell phones and GPS, as you may remember, and we had all these map books, and you would try and map out your route and memorize, and it was very important that you had a sense of direction. But even that is a far cry from being on the open seas. I think people should try and imagine what it would be like to be in the middle of the ocean, no land in sight, and trying to navigate your direction, and also be able to measure how far you've traveled, what your distance is. This is, in a way, it's actually very, very similar to figuring out how to get to the moon in terms of knowing relationships between planetary bodies and certain kinds of curvature, etc.
No, absolutely. And you have to develop a whole gamut, a whole array of technologies embedded in doing something like that. So this is the kind of embedded technologies that allowed for deep ocean travel. And as a principle, as a proof of principle, what Columbus was able to do was basically say that you can get anywhere in the globe. It wasn't that much. It was only a couple of decades later that Magellan did the first circumnavigation of the globe. You had all the Amerigo Vespucci voyages, etc. Once he did it once, then you suddenly open the power of the mind to conceptualize that you can really bring the entire globe into some kind of connection. And obviously you have many elements that can be embedded in that. Some of them quite good, some of them very horrible. There's no denying the kind of oligarchical element that also traveled the oceans in the succeeding decades. I think the reason why Columbus became the lightning rod for a whole culture wars type of thing that emerged, particularly around 1992. But I'm here in Virginia. Columbus Day doesn't exist. It doesn't. Right. The name doesn't come up at all. It's all the Indigenous Peoples Day.
Do you not have any Italians?
I guess not enough.
New York, forget it. Columbus will never be forgotten. But go.
Right. And last week, Trump signed some declaration which once restored the Columbus Day name. But the point about it is not to in any way dismiss the fact that there was tremendous population reduction among many peoples of the New World and so forth, and that you did have the introduction of slavery in the Caribbean and then in Brazil and then the United States. The British supervised a lot of it, brought into the United States, as people know. The Portuguese played a big role in terms of this. The Dutch did. But the point I want to make is in terms of the disease factors that are often discussed as a genocide that was unleashed. At any point that you begin to get interaction of peoples that have never had contact before, the disease pools resident in those peoples are going to create. There won't be immunities. There won't have developed capacity to deal with it. So yes, a lot of the populations of the indigenous populations of the Western Hemisphere were ravaged. Many of the populations in Europe were ravaged because some diseases came back that had not been known in Europe, and there were no. In other words, now are you going to say that you shouldn't? That you somehow keep hermetic bubbles around mankind? Are you trying to create a zoo where you have plexiglass around people or something? So clearly, I mean, there are inherent great challenges once you begin to have the idea of a one humanity that's going to be in contact with each other. But out of the Renaissance quality of the image of mankind, you get a certain scientific drive that ultimately can yield the breakthroughs of a Pasteur, for instance, in fighting disease for all of humanity. So
don't you think that the attack on Columbus is not merely because of the tragedy that befell so many of the indigenous people, and it was very mixed, and there were all kinds of matters, but also because the United States had a terrible cultural shift, which was anti-science. They didn't want other people to get the idea that you could be Columbus.
Exactly. I think that's the core of this. That it was an idea that, and I used to be involved. Did some anthropology in my college years, and right after that, I was in southern Mexico among an Indian group there called the Sinacantecos. They were Mayan, a part of the Mayan Indians, and I was very struck by the fact that a great deal of the I don't know what you want to call it, customs, the clothing, and so forth, is preserved. Going all the way back, this is not, there's a real Indian identity that has its a belief structure and so forth, with a lot of Christianity mixed into it and a lot of other things. But I was very moved. I was in an Indian community, and I'd been asked to become the godfather to a young child who was about 8 years old, and I would visit the family. And electricity was coming to this village because the Mexican government had built a large dam on the river, the Grijalva River, not too far away, and that brought in electricity. And so there was just a single light bulb in the one-room house. That light bulb allowed my godchild to begin to study at night. And you begin to realize these certain almost transfinite qualities of what happens when you enable populations to be able to have. I mean, the same thing in terms of if the women grind the corn to make tortillas with what's called a metate, and it's a stone like a rolling pin, and so very laborious. Takes 2 to 3 hours every day, and then you can hook a small grinder into a plug, and you can do that in a couple of minutes. So I want to illustrate this because, and this is an anecdote, by the way, which I mentioned before, but I know, Diane, you may have heard it. It's particularly relevant because it involves the Apollo project directly. I was in Chiapas in southern Mexico in 1969, in July 20th.
Oh,
so
wow.
This is the moon landing. And we anthropologists from Harvard were already infected with a lot of this counterculture stuff. And we weren't interested in the moon landing. We were turning into anti-American, this and that, because of the Vietnam War and so forth. But the Indians were fascinated by this. So we were running around trying to figure out how we could ask questions of the Indians about what we thought would be very interesting reactions, that since the moon is also a goddess in a lot of their cosmogony. So, the metique, that you're landing on this goddess. So we thought it'd be very interesting to see how they were going to reconcile this. The one store in the big market town nearby called San Cristobal Las Casas, which sold televisions, had a television running all the time in its store window. The Indians crowded down to watch the moon landing. Not a single one of the anthropologists bothered to go, had the slightest interest, including myself. So I say this because this cultural question is a very deep one, in the sense that there's a quality in mankind, and the Indians evinced it, of a certain, when you see a great achievement in terms of exploration that involves a whole array of technologies, a whole sequence of breakthroughs and so forth, that are adopted and taken as a mission by a nation or by groups of institutions and so forth. When you see the fruits of that in terms of something that was inconceivable earlier, it excites something that's fundamental in humanity. And Columbus's voyage represents that. Whatever, and it is a huge battle between oligarchical and more Republican humanist types of thinking. Fortunately, once the technology is available, you're able to get the Pilgrims over. You get over the Winthrops and the Massachusetts Bay Colony.
I mean, I do want to actually make a point here, because I forget the year, but Lyndon LaRouche wrote a paper, "What is God? That Man is in His Image," which was provoked because of a kind of debate where a group of Buddhist monks got very angry at the Pope, John Paul the second or sixth, I forget which Pope it was.
John Paul II,
Second, yeah, over his critique of their religion, which had to do with the relationship between man and God, actually. And it will very much offend our listeners to say that you can say that one culture is superior to another, and it has to do with that relationship and the specific empirical metrics. What is the life expectancy of the population? For example, a very obvious one: if people are dead by the age of 30, if they're racked by disease, if they're spending every moment of their waking life scraping together the means of existence, then the culture that promotes that or doesn't allow a scientific breakthrough to transform their standard of living is inferior. A culture that promotes cannibalism, which obviously would lower the average life expectancy, is an inferior culture. But that does not justify arrogance or pride, because there are innate qualities of human beings which are universal. And I think what you were describing is that you were coming from the United States, a culture which had been under attack from the Congress of Cultural Freedom, the Tavistock Institute, the Vietnam War, the rock, drug, sex, counterculture, the environmentalist movement. So you're there representing a culture, in effect, that's in decline, that's not the best that it was. You and your colleagues were not that interested, but the Mayans, or the people that you were among, actually still had not had this optimism or this curiosity snuffed out. And I think it also underscores why this dialogue is so important: the dialogue of cultures, the dialogue of civilizations, humility. One thing that I think is very striking about scientists, like Einstein, I think it was, who said that the more he knew, the more he studied, the more convinced he was that God existed. And we all know that you have that experience. You walk in nature and you just say, how can this be? How can this exist? Or you look at the sky and you say, how can everything be in such perfect proportion? And you are awestruck, rightly so, because we didn't create it, but somehow something created it. And then in a way, your life comes in perspective, that you have a mind that has a potential to understand it less imperfectly. And I think it's a sort of innocent sense of awe without the arrogance, the openness to discovery. And it's tricky, because you actually have to suspend your, not judgment, but suspend being judgmental to look at another culture and consider that there are aspects of it, even of cultures where the life expectancy itself may have been lower, but there may have been aspects of that culture which are superior that you can learn from, and you get an assimilation of the best of these cultures, which allows mankind to move forward. And that is what you would really hope would be the relationship among human beings on our planet, is that we would want our grandchildren or great-grandchildren to have a standard of living, a life expectancy that's very different, very much improved from where we live today. And if we want that change, it means obviously we're going to have to discover something that we don't already know,
Mm-hmm.
which
Well,
is hard. It's hard to do if you think that you're smarter than everyone else.
well, there's a big battle waged in the Iberian Peninsula, particularly in Spain, where many churchmen were defending the idea that the Indians, the indigenous, had a soul and had to be treated as human beings in a certain preliminary way, like the Declaration of Independence. And there were oligarchic elements around some of the conquistadores and others that had a very different view, obviously. But in Mexico, a bishop who was in the Yucatan area named Diego de Landa, I think he may have been Franciscan, I'm not sure, but he took an idea of basically destroying any elements of the Mayan culture that he came across. He learned enough to write a chronicle later, which has been very useful afterwards, but people estimate that somewhere like 95% of the codexes, which were the written form of the Mayan culture that he could get his hands on, he burned. Another bishop, though, named Vasco de Quiroga, went out to the Michoacan area in west central Mexico, set up all kinds of Indian villages where certain types of crafts were absorbed and developed for a whole interacting economy around more skilled work. And he had the Bible translated into the local languages in order to be able to try to evangelize, but not eradicate the languages of the Indians. So I mentioned this to you because the battle continues. This is not people should not go into this and let themselves fall into exactly what you were saying. The subtext of much of the attack on Columbus is that every society should be just left alone, that you should not allow Western civilization to stunt the indigenous cultures, etc. But there can be exactly what you're saying. You can have a collaboration among these cultures that can absorb something that improves but does not annihilate the differences in these cultures. And that has to be what we take forward. So rather than trying to relitigate the last 500 years, let's take the Renaissance, let's take the positive conception of mankind that was generated in places like the Council of Florence, which Cusa represented, and which was deliberately then fostered as part of an exploration project to bring this to the whole world. Let's take the next 250 years to build on that potential that was created by these forerunners.
Exactly right. Well, I think we should wrap up, but thank you very much. Are there any concluding thoughts you would like to share before we wrap up?
I would just encourage people to go to Florence. Obviously, but when you actually just feel and see, and there's just it's just so thrilling. And then you realize these many generational intense connections to what then changed the entire world. I mean, Columbus's voyage, good, bad, whatever, it was a different world after that. And when you realize that this was the germs of this effort took place under that dome, and you have Toscanelli's beam of light coming in. I mean, this is a tremendous tease to what at the end of Keats's poem, to tease the thought, to tease the mind, doth tease the mind into eternity or something. That's all you that's all ye know on earth and all you need to know. So anyway, Florence is a beautiful tease to the mind.
Great.
And I wouldn't, there are places in Lisbon and so forth where a lot of this is also very, very rich. I haven't been able to be there, but I know people who have said that. But I would just stress that we need to create the kind of the deliberations that were represented by the Council of Florence today, which is the point you're making in terms of the standpoint that we need. And Cusa is such a rich source of the conceptions for that, and the fact that he was in the middle of the group that launched the Columbus Project is just a stunning, wonderful, hidden piece of history.
Yes. Great. Well, thank you very much. And our viewers can hope to hear more on the LaRouche organization's perspective for celebrating the first 250 years of our American Republic and making sure the second 250 years are much better than the first. So thank you very much.
Sure. Delighted to be here.